By the time the will was read aloud in that small law office in Columbus, Ohio, two of Raymond Holt's sons had not spoken to each other in 5 days. The third wasn't there at all, and the one who received everything was someone most of the family had spent years pretending didn't exist. This is not a story about money. It is a story about what a man sees when the noise finally stops, what he notices when he no longer has the luxury of looking away, and what he chooses to do with the little time he has left when the truth becomes the only thing worth leaving behind. Raymond Holt was 71 years old when the doctors at Ohio State Wexner Medical Center told him he had at most 8 weeks to live. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He sat in that office alone. He had driven himself there, as he had done everything in his life, alone, quietly, without asking for help. The doctor spoke carefully, the way doctors do when they are delivering news they have practiced delivering. Raymond nodded. He thanked the man. He walked to his truck, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, and then drove to his favorite diner on Broad Street and ordered a plate of eggs and black coffee. He did not call his sons. He sat by the window, watched the morning traffic move through Columbus, and thought about his life the way a man thinks about a house he's about to leave, slowly walking through every room, taking inventory, deciding what was worth keeping and what should have been thrown out years ago. Raymond had built Holt Construction over 34 years, started with a single flatbed truck, a used cement mixer, and a reputation for showing up on time and doing what he said he would do. By the time he was 50, he had 40 employees, 3 active commercial contracts, and a name that meant something in Central Ohio. He was not a billionaire, he was not famous, but he was respected. And in the world Raymond came from, respect was the currency that mattered most. He had been married once. His wife, Carol, had passed 11 years earlier from a stroke that took her quickly, mercifully in her sleep. He had never remarried. He kept her photograph on the kitchen windowsill, next to a small wooden cross she had given him on their 20th anniversary. He was a man of quiet faith, not the kind that announced itself, but the kind that showed up in how he treated people when no one was watching. He had 2 sons. Derek was 49, the older one. Broad-shouldered, well-dressed, with the kind of easy confidence that came from always being told he was the smartest person in the room. He had joined the company at 26 and had risen quickly, taking over day-to-day operations while Raymond stepped back. He drove a late-model Mercedes. He lived in a house in Dublin, one of Columbus's wealthier suburbs. He spoke about the company the way men speak about things they already consider theirs. Marcus was 46, quieter than his brother, but not in the way that reflected depth. His was the quiet of someone who had learned that the easiest way to survive beside a dominant personality was to agree and disappear. He had followed Derek into the company, taken a mid-level management role, and had spent the better part of 2 decades nodding at his brother's decisions, whether those decisions were wise or not. And then there was Caleb. Caleb Holt was 38. He was Raymond's nephew, the only son of Raymond's younger sister, Patricia, who had died of cancer herself when Caleb was 19, leaving him with nothing but a small apartment lease he couldn't afford and a name that connected him to a family that mostly regarded him as an obligation. Raymond had quietly paid Caleb's way through a community college accounting program. When Caleb graduated, Raymond gave him a job in the back office of Holt Construction, accounts payable, vendor records, contract filing, work that nobody noticed, work that nobody celebrated. Caleb did it without complaint. He came in early, he stayed late. He never asked for a promotion, never demanded recognition, and never, not once in 12 years, made Raymond feel as though the help he had been given created a debt that needed to be repaid. The family treated him like furniture. Derek referred to him as the bookkeeper in meetings, even when Caleb was standing in the room. Marcus simply ignored him. At company Christmas gatherings, Caleb sat at the end of the table, ate quietly, and left early. Nobody noticed when he arrived. Nobody noticed when he left. Raymond noticed. He had always noticed, but he was a man who believed in watching before acting, in letting time reveal what impatience would miss. And so he had watched. For years he had watched. This channel is growing because of people who appreciate stories with meaning. Stories that remind us what loyalty looks like, what betrayal costs, and what a life well lived really leaves behind. If this story has already caught your attention, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Whether you're in Ohio or Oregon, Texas or Toronto, we are truly glad you're here. Now, let's continue. Raymond did not tell anyone about his diagnosis for the first 2 weeks. He went back to work. He attended a project meeting on a Wednesday morning, reviewed contractor invoices on Thursday, and on Friday afternoon drove out to a job site in Westerville to walk the ground the way he always had. Boots on dirt, hand on the framing, eyes moving slowly across every detail. He was in pain. He managed it quietly. What he was really doing during those 2 weeks was watching. He had spent his career reading people, reading the way a subcontractor's eyes shifted when a bid was too low, reading the way a foreman stood when something had gone wrong on site, reading the gap between what people said and what their behavior confirmed. He applied that same careful attention now, with new urgency, to the people closest to him. He started with the financials, not the reports that came across his desk. Those had been filtered through Derek for years. He went deeper. He asked Caleb quietly, one afternoon after everyone else had gone home, to pull the raw vendor payment records for the last 6 years and leave them on his desk without mentioning it to anyone. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have them for you by morning." He did not ask why. What Raymond found over the following week was not a surprise exactly. It was more like the confirmation of a feeling he had carried for a long time, but had never been willing to sit with fully, because to confirm it would mean confronting what it said about his sons and about his own years of looking the other way. Derek had been routing contracts, small ones at first, then progressively larger, through a company called Apex Site Services LLC. On paper, Apex was an independent subcontractor. In practice, it was a shell company registered in Delaware, with a single beneficial owner whose name Raymond had to request from the state registry to confirm. Derek Allen Holt, his own son. For 6 years, Derek had been paying Apex, paying himself, for services that were either inflated well beyond market rate or, in several cases, never rendered at all. The amounts ranged from small enough to miss to significant enough to hurt. In total, Raymond's accountant, a man he trusted completely who worked outside the company, estimated the diversion at just over $400,000. Marcus had known. Raymond found the email thread the following day buried in an archived folder that had not been deleted carefully enough. Marcus had questioned it once, 2 years in. Derek's response had been brief and direct. "You're already in this. Don't make problems." Marcus had not made problems. Raymond sat in his office with the door closed and the lights low and read through everything twice. Then he put the documents in a folder, locked the folder in his desk, and drove home. He did not confront them. He went home, sat at his kitchen table, looked at Carol's photograph on the windowsill, and said out loud, to no one, or perhaps to someone, "I should have looked sooner." Then he bowed his head and prayed, not for justice exactly, but for clarity, for the wisdom to respond to what he now knew in a way that was worthy of the man he had tried to be. That night, he called his attorney. His name was Gerald Whitmore, a quiet, precise man in his early 60s who had handled Raymond's legal affairs for over 2 decades. Raymond told him everything. He told him about the diagnosis. He told him about Apex. He told him what he intended to do. Gerald listened without interrupting. When Raymond finished, there was a long pause. Then Gerald said, "Raymond, are you sure?" Raymond said, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Gerald Whitmore had seen a great many things in 30 years of estate law. He had watched families fracture over antique furniture and china sets. He had mediated disputes between siblings who had not spoken in a decade over the distribution of a savings account that barely covered the legal fees to contest it. He was not a man easily surprised by what grief and money could do to people who had once loved each other. But what Raymond Holt was asking him to do was not born from bitterness. That was what struck Gerald most. He'd expected anger. He'd expected the cold, hard edges of a man who felt betrayed and wanted the law to make it right. What he found instead was something quieter. Raymond spoke about his sons the way you speak about a disappointment you have finally made peace with sadness, yes, but without the trembling heat of fresh rage. He wanted the record to be accurate, he wanted the truth to be documented, and he wanted the people who deserved to inherit what he had built to actually receive it. Gerald drew up the new will over 3 days. Raymond reviewed it on a Tuesday afternoon, made 2 small changes, and signed it in Gerald's office with 2 witnesses present. Then he drove to a recording studio on the east side of Columbus, a small place he had found through a referral, and recorded a video statement. 22 minutes. Calm, clear. Dressed in a simple gray shirt, no jacket, no performance. He looked directly into the camera and explained every decision he had made in the measured tone of a man who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. When it was done, he handed the drive to Gerald and said, "Keep this with the will." He told his sons about the cancer on a Thursday evening. He invited them to the house, both Derek and Marcus, and sat them down in the living room where they had grown up. He told them he was ill. He told them it was serious. He told them the timeline the doctors had given him. Derek's first response, after a brief silence, was to ask whether Raymond had updated his estate documents. Raymond looked at his son for a long moment. "I'm handling it," he said. Marcus said very little. He looked at his hands. He asked if Raymond needed anything. Meals, help around the house. Raymond said he was fine. The visit lasted 40 minutes. When they left, Derek was already on his phone before he reached the end of the driveway. Caleb came the following evening. Nobody had called him. Raymond had not reached out. Caleb had heard through someone at the office that Raymond had taken several medical appointments and had not been himself. He showed up at the door with a container of soup his neighbor had made, a paperback novel he thought Raymond might like, and nothing else. He did not ask about the will. He did not ask about the company. He sat in the kitchen with Raymond for 2 hours. They talked about baseball. They talked about Patricia, Caleb's mother. And Raymond told stories about her that Caleb had never heard. Stories from when they were children in a small house in Lancaster, Ohio. Stories that made them both laugh and then go quiet in the way you go quiet when laughter and grief share the same moment. When Caleb stood to leave, Raymond said, "Come back when you can." Caleb said, "I'll be here tomorrow." He was. For the next 6 weeks, Caleb came every evening after work. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes he just came. He read to Raymond when Raymond's eyes were too tired for the page. He drove him to 3 of his medical appointments without being asked, simply by noticing the dates written on the notepad by the phone and arranging his schedule around them. He sat in waiting rooms without complaint. He never made Raymond feel like a burden. He never made him feel like a task. He simply showed up. In those 6 weeks, Raymond watched his sons visit a combined total of 9 times. 7 of those visits included some reference to the business, a contract question, a staffing issue, something that needed Raymond's signature or approval. On 2 occasions, Derek arrived with documents. He never stayed longer than an hour. Raymond received all of it without comment. He signed what needed to be signed. He answered what needed to be answered. And he continued to watch. There is something that happens to a man when he knows his time is genuinely limited. The trivial falls away completely. The pretense becomes exhausting and then impossible. What remains is a kind of stark, clarifying vision, the ability to see people not as you wish they were, not as they present themselves, but as they actually are. Raymond had always been perceptive, but the illness sharpened him in a way that felt almost like a gift. He could see, with a precision he had never had before, exactly who each person was when they stood in his living room. He saw Derek's eyes move to the framed photographs on the mantel, the way an appraiser's eyes move across a room, cataloging, assessing, calculating. He saw Marcus hover near the edges of conversations, agreeing with whoever had last spoken, a man who had outsourced his conscience so long ago he could no longer locate it. He saw Caleb sit on the floor beside his chair one evening, reading a passage aloud from a book about the American West, and laugh at a line so genuinely that the whole room felt lighter. He made his peace. There is a verse Raymond had kept close to him for most of his adult life. He had first heard it from his mother in the small Baptist church they attended in Lancaster when he was a boy. She had stitched it onto a piece of cloth that hung in their kitchen for as long as he could remember. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Raymond believed that. He believed that time had its own intelligence, that if you were patient enough, if you were willing to wait and watch and trust that truth had a way of surfacing on its own, you would eventually see clearly what you needed to see. He had waited long enough. He had seen clearly. Now it was time to act. We're pausing here for just a moment because if you've stayed with this story this far, you already understand what it's really about. It's not about money or property. It's about what we notice, what we choose, and what we leave behind. If this story is speaking to you, please share it with someone in your life, a sibling, a friend, someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Stories like this one are published regularly on this channel, and we don't want you to miss a single one. 3 days before Raymond passed, he asked Gerald Whitmore to come to the house. Gerald came on a Sunday afternoon. They sat in the living room. Raymond was in his chair by the window, the same chair he had sat in for 20 years, the same chair where he had watched his sons grow up, where he had read his Bible on Sunday mornings, where he had grieved his wife and made his peace with a life that had not been without pain, but had not been without grace either. He went over everything with Gerald one final time. He was clear. He was precise. He asked Gerald to read back certain provisions to confirm they said exactly what he intended. He asked 3 specific questions. He received 3 clear answers. Then he said, "Good. That's all I needed." He looked out the window at the oak tree in the front yard, a tree he had planted the year Derek was born. It was late October. The leaves were almost entirely gone. The branches were bare and gray against a white sky. He said quietly, more to himself than to Gerald, "It's all right. It's all right." Gerald did not respond. Some moments are not for response. He closed his briefcase, shook Raymond's hand, and drove back to his office. On Wednesday morning, Caleb arrived at the house as usual. He found Raymond's neighbor, an older woman named Dolores, sitting on the front porch. She had been there since early morning. She looked up when Caleb came up the walk, and she didn't need to say anything. Caleb sat down beside her. They sat together in silence for a while. Then Caleb bowed his head. The reading of the will took place 11 days after Raymond's funeral, in Gerald Whitmore's office on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Columbus. It was a gray November morning, the kind of morning that feels like the sky itself is in mourning. Low clouds, cold air, the last of the season's leaves pressed flat and dark against the wet pavement. Derek arrived first. He was dressed sharply, in a dark coat, and he sat with the posture of a man who had already decided how the next hour would go. He had brought his personal attorney, a detail Gerald noted without comment. Marcus arrived 5 minutes later, alone. He sat across from Derek and did not make eye contact with him. They had barely spoken since the funeral. Something had shifted between them. A fault line that had been building for years had finally, quietly, broken open. Caleb arrived last. He wore a plain dark jacket and carried nothing. He nodded to Gerald, sat in the remaining chair, and folded his hands in his lap. Gerald began. He read the standard provisions first, the medical directives, the arrangements for outstanding debts, the charitable donations Raymond had specified, a contribution to their childhood church in Lancaster, a scholarship fund administered through Columbus State Community College for students pursuing vocational trades, a modest gift to Dolores, the neighbor who had sat with Caleb on the porch that Wednesday morning. Derek was still. His attorney made a note. Then Gerald read the primary distribution. Holt Construction, the entirety of Raymond's ownership stake, the equipment, the active contracts, the company accounts, the property on which the main office sat, was left to Caleb Thomas Holt. The house in which Raymond had lived for 31 years, along with its contents and the land it occupied, was left to Caleb Thomas Holt. The remainder of Raymond's personal savings and investment accounts, after charitable distributions, was left to Caleb Thomas Holt. Derek and Marcus each received an envelope. Gerald placed both envelopes on the table without comment. Derek stared at his for 3 full seconds. Then he looked up at Gerald. His voice, when it came, was controlled, but only barely. "This isn't legal," he said. He was ill. He wasn't in his right mind. Gerald reached into the folder in front of him and removed a USB drive. He placed it on the table. "Your father recorded a video statement 22 days before his passing," Gerald said. "He was examined by his physician that same week and certified to be of sound mind and full legal capacity. The statement explains his decisions in his own words. It is part of the official estate record." Derek's attorney leaned forward and said something quietly into his client's ear. Derek did not respond. He was staring at the envelope. Marcus had not said a single word. He reached out slowly and picked up his envelope. He held it for a moment. Then he opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, and behind it a small stack of printed documents, a dozen pages clipped together. He unfolded the letter first. It was handwritten. Raymond's handwriting, careful, upright, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write in an era when it was taught seriously. It said, "Marcus, I've known for some time, not everything, but enough. You are not a cruel man, but you became a silent one, and silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of choice. I do not leave you this letter in anger. I leave it in the hope that you will read it, sit with it, and decide, while you still have time, what kind of man you want the rest of your life to say you were. Your father." Behind the letter were the printed records, the email thread, the Apex invoices, the payments. Marcus set the papers down on the table carefully. His hands were steady. His face was not. Derek had opened his envelope by then. His letter was shorter. "Derek, I built this for 34 years. You took from it for 6. The records are documented and have been provided to the estate attorney in full. What happens next is not my decision. It is yours and God's, your father." What followed in the weeks after the reading was exactly what Raymond had anticipated. Derek moved immediately to contest the will. He filed on the grounds of undue influence, claiming that Caleb had manipulated a dying man into changing his estate documents. His attorney was aggressive. The filing was detailed. It was also, ultimately, hollow. Gerald had prepared for this with the thoroughness of a man who had known Raymond Holt for 22 years and had understood, when Raymond first called him from that hospital parking lot, that the challenge was coming. The video statement was submitted to the court. In it, Raymond looked directly at the camera for 22 minutes and explained, in the calm and measured voice of a man who had nothing to fear and nothing to hide, exactly why he had made the decisions he had made. He described with specificity what the financial records showed. He described what he had observed over 6 weeks of watching his sons. He described what Caleb had done, not in dramatic terms, but in plain ones. "Caleb did not ask for anything," Raymond said on the recording. "He did not position himself. He did not perform. He simply showed up and helped me, the way a person helps someone they genuinely care about. I have been in business long enough to know the difference between a man who is kind because he wants something and a man who is kind because that is who he is." The court reviewed the statement. It reviewed the physician's certification. It reviewed Gerald's documentation of the legal process. The challenge was dismissed. Then the investigation began. It had not been initiated by Caleb. It had not been initiated by the estate. It had been initiated by 2 of Holt Construction's former vendors who, during the course of the estate proceedings, had been contacted by the estate's accountant for routine financial reconciliation, and who had, in the course of those conversations, mentioned discrepancies they had noticed years earlier but had never reported. The Ohio Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry into Apex Site Services, LLC. Derek hired a criminal defense attorney within a week of the inquiry becoming public. Marcus, in a decision that surprised almost everyone, agreed to cooperate with investigators. He gave a full statement. He acknowledged what he had known, when he had known it, and what he had failed to do about it. His attorney negotiated on his behalf. He was not charged criminally. But the statement, and the fact that he had given it, cost him his relationship with his brother entirely and permanently. They have not spoken since. Caleb did not follow any of this closely. He was busy. He had inherited a company with 41 employees, 3 active contracts, and a name that had meant something in Central Ohio for over 3 decades. He had also inherited a set of books that needed to be cleaned up, a management structure that needed to be rebuilt, and a staff that was watching him carefully, waiting to see if the quiet man from the back office had what it took. He moved into the role the way he had always moved through life, methodically, without announcement, by doing the work. His first act as owner was to call an all-staff meeting. He stood in front of 41 people, many of whom had worked for Raymond for a decade or more, and he said simply, "I know most of you didn't expect this. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I have all the answers. What I will tell you is that Raymond Holt built something worth protecting, and I intend to protect it. I need your help to do that, and I promise to be straight with you. Always." He reinstated 3 employees Derek had terminated the previous year, 2 site foremen and a project coordinator, whose dismissals, Caleb had long suspected, were connected to their proximity to the Apex accounting irregularities. He reached out personally to each of Holt Construction's active clients, introduced himself, and asked for 30 minutes to sit down and discuss the projects face-to-face. He hired an independent auditor to review 3 years of financials and produce a clean report. He was thorough, he was honest, he was quiet about all of it. There is a particular quality that belongs to people who were never given anything easily. They do not take what they have for granted because they remember, clearly, specifically, what it felt like to have nothing. They do not perform gratitude because theirs is not a performance. It is a posture, a way of moving through the world that was shaped by years of receiving very little and still finding reasons to show up. Caleb Holt was that kind of person. He had grown up watching his mother, Patricia, work 2 jobs and still come home with enough energy to sit at the kitchen table and help him with his homework. He had watched her face hardship without bitterness, watched her pray without ceasing, watched her extend kindness to people who had given her no particular reason for it, simply because it was, as she used to say, the right way to be in the world. She had died when he was 19. He had grieved her the way young men grieve mothers, quietly, incompletely, in pieces spread out over years. There were mornings in his late 20s when he would be driving to work and a song on the radio, or the particular color of the light, or nothing at all, would bring the grief back with a sudden and specific clarity that took his breath away. He kept a photograph of her on his desk, a small one, in a plain wooden frame, her in the kitchen of the Lancaster house, laughing at something just off camera, the joy in her face so real, so unguarded, that it had always made him feel, when he looked at it, that the world was still fundamentally good, even when it was hard. He put that photograph on the desk in Raymond's office, his office now, the week he moved in. Beside it, he placed the small wooden cross that had been on Raymond's kitchen windowsill, Carol's cross. He felt it belonged there. He felt that both of them, his mother, Raymond's wife, would have understood each other, 2 women of quiet faith who had loved difficult things, without complaint, and left behind men who were better for it. 6 months after Raymond's death, Caleb drove to Lancaster. He had not been back in years. The town was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps it was simply that he had grown into a larger version of himself, and the scale of childhood places always contracted when you returned to them as an adult. He drove past the house where he and Patricia had lived. It had been repainted. New owners. A child's bicycle on the porch. He did not stop. He sat at the corner for a moment and looked at it, and then drove on. He found the Baptist church where Raymond had grown up, the one that had received a contribution from the estate. It was a modest building, white-painted brick with a small parking lot and a marquee sign out front. The current pastor was a man named Reverend Thomas Carter, who had known Raymond slightly, and welcomed Caleb warmly when he knocked on the office door unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. They sat together for over an hour. Caleb explained who he was and what had brought him there. Reverend Carter listened the way good listeners do, fully, without filling the silences. When Caleb finished, the older man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your uncle was a man who understood that character is what you do when no one is watching. Sounds like you understood the same thing." Caleb looked at his hands. "I was just doing what felt right," he said. "Yes," Reverend Carter said, "that's exactly it. There's a question that comes up when people hear a story like this one. It is a question about fairness, about whether it is right that things ended the way they did, whether Derek's exposure, Marcus's isolation, Caleb's inheritance constitute something we can genuinely call justice, whether the math adds up. It is a fair question, and the honest answer is that the world does not always arrange itself into clean moral equations. Not every betrayal is exposed. Not every loyal person is rewarded. Not every dying father has the clarity and the courage to look honestly at what his family has become and respond with integrity rather than denial. Raymond Holt was not a perfect man. He had spent years choosing not to see what was in front of him, because the seeing would have cost him something he wasn't ready to pay. The comfortable story he told himself about his sons, about his family, about the company he had built and what it meant. He had let things go on longer than they should have, because confrontation is hard, because love makes us generous with excuses, because it is easier to look away. He only looked fully when time forced him to. That is not exceptional. That is human. What was exceptional was what he did once he looked. He did not explode. He did not confront in anger and create a scene that would have allowed his sons to position themselves as victims of his rage. He did not make it about himself, about his own wound, his own betrayal, his own legacy. He gathered the truth carefully and documented it. He made a plan that was not about punishment, but about accuracy, about ensuring that what he had built ended up in the hands of someone who would care for it the way it deserved to be cared for. He prayed about it. He acted on what he believed was right. And then he let go. There is a word for that. Wisdom. Not the theoretical kind, not the kind you read about, the kind that only comes from having lived long enough to know what actually matters and having enough faith to act on it, even when it is hard. Holt Construction celebrated its 35th anniversary the following spring. Caleb organized a small gathering for the staff. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would have felt out of character for the company Raymond had built. A catered lunch in the main yard, a few remarks, a moment of silence for Raymond, offered by one of the long-serving foremen who had known him since the beginning. Caleb spoke briefly. He thanked the staff. He talked about what Raymond had built, not in terms of revenue or contracts, but in terms of the standard he had set, the standard of showing up, of doing what you said you would do, of treating people fairly regardless of whether anyone important was watching. He said, "I did not expect to be standing here. I am not sure Raymond expected it either, at least not until near the end. But I have learned that the best things in my life have come not from what I pursued, but from what I did quietly, consistently, when I thought no one was keeping track." He paused. Someone was always keeping track. The yard was quiet. Then the foreman started clapping, and the others joined in, and it lasted longer than anyone expected. Derek Holt's case was resolved 14 months after Raymond's death. He reached a civil settlement with the estate, returning a portion of the diverted funds in exchange for the estate's agreement not to pursue further civil litigation. The criminal inquiry did not result in charges, a fact his attorney described as a favorable outcome and that Derek described publicly as vindication. People who had known Raymond did not use that word. Derek sold his house in Dublin the following year and moved to Arizona. He started a small real estate consulting business. He did not speak publicly about his father or the estate. Marcus stayed in Columbus. He left the construction industry entirely and took a position with a nonprofit that provided job training for formerly incarcerated men. People who knew him said he had changed, that he was quieter now, more deliberate, that he carried something in his face that had not been there before. Some called it shame. Others called it the beginning of conscience. Perhaps both were true. On what would have been Raymond's 73rd birthday, Caleb drove to the cemetery in Lancaster where Raymond was buried beside Carol. He brought two things, a small bunch of flowers and the paperback novel he had been reading to Raymond in those last weeks, the one about the American West, the one that had made them both laugh. He stood at the grave for a while. He did not have a speech prepared. He was not the kind of man who prepared speeches. He stood in the November cold, in the quiet of that cemetery on the edge of the small Ohio town where Raymond had grown up and where he was now returned, and he felt, in the way you feel things at graves without words, in the part of you that is older than language, that Raymond was at peace. He placed the flowers down. He set the book beside them, briefly, and then tucked it back under his arm. He would finish it at home. It felt right to finish it, he said quietly, out loud. Thank you for seeing me. Then he walked back to his truck, started the engine, and drove home to Columbus, past the bare fields and the old farmhouses and the long flat stretches of Central Ohio Highway, back to the company, back to the work, back to the life that a man who had watched him closely and chosen carefully had seen fit to leave in his hands. There are people in your life right now who are watching, not judging, not cataloging your failures or measuring your success, simply watching the way Raymond watched, with the patience of someone who knows that character is not a declaration but a pattern revealed slowly over time through ordinary moments when nothing particular is at stake. They are watching how you treat people who cannot do anything for you. They are watching what you do when loyalty is inconvenient. They are watching whether you show up. Most of them will never tell you they are watching. Some of them, the rarest ones, will one day show you in the only way that cannot be argued with or taken back. If there is someone in your life who has quietly, consistently, without recognition or reward, simply been there, reach out to them today. Tell them you see them. Tell them it matters. And if you are the one who has been showing up quietly for years without acknowledgement, keep going. Someone is always keeping track. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Raymond believed that. So do we. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you think about your own family or your own legacy, please share it. Share it with a sibling, a parent, a friend, a grown child. These are the stories that matter most, not because they are dramatic, but because they are true in all the ways that count. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Every story we tell is crafted with this same care, for people who have lived enough to know that the deepest lessons come not from noise, but from the quiet, steady truth that time eventually reveals. We are grateful you watched all the way to the end. That says something about you. We'll see you in the next story.